to Life with David. I'm David, and today I'm continuing the repair of my 1968 Volkswagen Karmann Ghia engine. A couple of videos ago, I removed the engine and discovered the valve guides and seats were shot. I replaced the heads, cylinders, and pistons, but I haven't shown that video yet since I had some overheating issues. I had to remove the engine again to resolve the overheating issues. In this video, I'm going to show a mashup of both reassemblies so I can point out the issues I found and how I resolved them. So why don't you join me as I reassemble the engine with new heads, pistons, and cylinders. I'd like to spend a moment on safety. There's nothing more important than keeping you and your loved ones safe. Be sure to read, understand, and follow the safety rules for your tools. Using your tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And always use the appropriate eye, hearing, and respiratory personal protective equipment. In this video, we're working with all kinds of things that can hurt you. You can burn and pinch yourself, so keep your head in the game. If you're following along, you're doing so at your own risk. Make sure you have a good Volkswagen manual like John Muir's How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive, or a Bentley or Hayes guide. And if you don't feel comfortable doing any of these activities, then don't. Now let's get started. I wanted new single port heads for my Karmann Ghia. For a standard 1600cc engine, I think single port heads offer better drivability. 13 years ago, when I did the last rebuild of this engine, I couldn't get new single port heads, so I just refurbished the heads I had. This time, I found new heads from China. However, I didn't realize how much work they needed to work in a stock engine. For those who are following along, this is fail number 7. I should have rebuilt the old German heads again rather than install new Chinese heads. The machining of the heads was good, but the casting quality was poor. I spent several hours using files, a cutoff wheel, and a hacksaw to trim and blend the cooling fins to ensure proper airflow. The intake and exhaust runners were also very rough, and I spent a few more hours blending and polishing the heads. Fail number 8. I didn't realize at the time that there wasn't any clearance for the air flap control rod. For those who don't run thermostats, that's not a problem, but for those of us who run stock engines, it's a deal. I wound up having to try to clearance the area between the intake runners after the head was already on the engine. It's not a good job, and it wound up interfering with the control rod. During the second assembly, I used files to get the proper clearance. Fail number 9. I didn't deburr the pushrod tube seal area the first time. The burrs dug into the seals and interfered with proper torquing of the head nuts. Later, after the engine heated up, the burrs cut the pushrod seals, which led to loosening of the head nuts and oil leaks. When I checked the head torques before I removed the heads for the second time, I found the nuts were very loose, only finger tight.
It's very loose. All these are very, very loose. One's up here, fine.
During the second assembly, I used the flapper wheel to clean up the burrs. I believe this was the biggest single source of my overheating issues. You can see evidence of the heads leaking here after only 200 miles. Leaking heads cause the engine to heat up from the outside, especially at high speeds. During the first assembly, I assumed that I didn't need to adjust the cylinder deck height. Fail number 10. I should have checked the combustion chamber volume and deck height. During the second assembly, I did check them, and to my pleasant surprise, the combustion chambers all had the same volume of 53 cc's. After checking the deck height, which is the distance from the top of the piston to the top of the cylinder, I installed 10 thousandths shims under the cylinders to bring the compression ratio to about 7.3 to 1. This is a little low, but at this point I wanted to err on the side of cooler operation. Before installation, I checked the weights of the new pistons and wrist pins. I was very pleased to see that all the piston assemblies were within a half a gram of each other. I was careful to keep the pistons and cylinders matched together. When I installed the cylinders for the first time, I used the recommended paper gaskets with a little aviation Permatex. Since I used 10 thousandths shims under the cylinders during the second build, I needed to clean the paper off the cylinders and crankcase sealing surfaces. I used a knife and light honing to clean the surfaces up. Quite a few engine builders use a little RTV between the cylinder and crankcase to stop oil leaks. However, because RTV cures quickly, you have to work really fast to get all 4 cylinders and heads installed and torqued before the sealant hardens. I don't work that fast, so I use an anaerobic sealant that hardens in 24 hours instead. I put all the cylinders with the shims in place, first making sure to stagger the piston ring gaps with the oil control ring gap on top and the compression ring gaps at 120 degrees to each side. After the cylinders were on the pistons, I put a very thin film of sealant on both sides of each shim before setting them in place. Then I installed the heads, pushrod tubes, new silicone pushrod tube seals, and most importantly, the bottom cylinder deflector tins, which are also known as the "aw shit" plates. You can probably guess why they have that name, since they can't be installed after the heads are on, and the engine will burn up without them. Next, I tightened the head nuts using the specified torquing procedure. Spoiler alert, although everything torqued properly, the torquing felt a little mushy. After the heads were installed, I turned my attention to the oil cooler. The inside of the cooler looked pretty clean, but I wanted to wring every last BTU out of the oil, so I decided to boil it out. I talked to a couple radiator shops, but they don't do that anymore. After thinking long and hard, I decided to do it myself. With a liner in a large crock pot, I added the oil cooler, water, borax, and about a quarter cup of laundry detergent. I let it cook for a day on high, then I drained the cooler and changed the water and detergent. I cooked it for another 8 hours and drained and rinsed the cooler again. Then I filled it with mineral spirits and let it sit for another day. After draining out the mineral spirits, I blew it off with compressed air. Finally, I painted the outside with a thin coat of black paint and reinstalled the cooler. Now it was time to install the engine cooling tins. These pieces of sheet metal direct the cooling air from the fan down across the heads and cylinders to the bottom where they exit toward the rear of the engine. Each piece of tin is extremely important. Without them, the engine will overheat. It's important that they are all properly installed and there is no blockage. The sequence of installing the engine tins is intertwined with the installation of other engine components. I've already showed you that the cylinder air deflector plates needed to be installed before the heads are installed. Well, the lower engine shrouds need to be installed before the front heater boxes are installed. Don't ask me how I know this. After the lower engine tins are installed, I reinstalled the front heater boxes. These carry the exhaust gases from the number 1 and 3 cylinders to the muffler. Then I installed the muffler, which also includes the rear heater boxes. At this point, I installed the upper cylinder shrouds. Before I installed the intake manifold, I blew through the heat riser pipe to check for pluggage. There seemed to be a little pluggage, so I used a length of wire rope chucked in a drill to clean the pipe. Then I loosely installed the intake manifold since it needs to move a little when the fan shroud is installed. Next, I installed the front engine cover plate. Be careful when installing the fan shroud. Not only does it have to slip over the oil cooler, but you have to insert the air control connecting rod through the hole in the head at the same time. After the fan shroud is in place, tighten up the 2 shroud mounting screws, the generator strap, and the intake manifold. Make sure that the air control connecting rod can move freely. After I install the thermostat and the lower right rear engine shroud, I put the engine back in the car. This is simply the reverse of pulling the engine, except the language is a little more salty while trying to get the clutch splines to line up. After the engine was securely bolted in place, I reinstalled the fuel lines, throttle cable, plug wires, rear engine cover plate, and the preheater pipe sealing plates. Then I installed the generator belt and the pulley cover. I filled the engine with oil and then installed the rest of the wiring, the air cleaner, fresh air heat and intake preheat hoses, and reinstalled the intake preheat Borden tube. It was finally time to start the engine. I disconnected the coil so I could crank the engine to get oil to the bearings before it started. Then I reconnected the coil and the engine started right up. I tweaked the timing a little and then took it for a little drive. At first it drove great, but after the first trip on the freeway, I noticed that it still ran a little hot. Thanks for joining me today. We addressed 3 main issues regarding the overheating of my Karmann Ghia, including improving the fit of the pushrod tube seals, cleaning the oil cooler, and adjusting the compression ratio. The engine ran great during its first few trips after the second rebuild, but a trip on the freeway caused some overheating issues to return. I now know what's causing those overheating issues. failing lower head studs on the numbers 1, 3, and 4 cylinders. I need case savers, and I will tackle those repairs in a future video. I edited down over 50 hours of raw footage to keep this video short. However, I would be happy to delve deeply into any area you would like. Just leave me a comment below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down, and leave a comment or suggestion for things to do. I hope to do more of these videos, so please subscribe and click on the bell for notifications of new videos. Let's get together next time for another day in Life with David. See you soon.